Luke 15, and we're not going to have any slides, but you can follow along in your Bible if you want to. I'm going to be taking the father's perspective, and Sean is going to be taking the prodigal son's perspective, and Evan is going to take the perspective of the other son. I have to say that becoming a father probably affected me spiritually as much as any experience in my life. Obviously, other than prayer and Bible study and all that. But as far as life experiences go, becoming a father really changed just my view, because I had always been a son, and I thought I knew what it would be like to be a father. But after becoming a father, it really does change your spiritual life drastically, or it did mine anyway. It's a story about a son who ran away, and it's really a story about the father, and it's a story about the son who stayed home. I think each one of those apply. It's a parable. It's a story that's fairly short, and you could spend hours looking at different perspectives and be very helpful. But we've probably all identified with either wanting to run away from home sometime as kids, or maybe as parents we've had our children threaten that we're going to run away. So we've all experienced that one way or another. Phil mentioned last week how whenever his father died, he remembered the date and referred to all of that. And it's been really a year and a week, or less than a week, since my father passed away. And as I think about this story, I think about that. But in this particular case, this story says, from a son's perspective, Dad, I wish you were dead. And that's quite an interesting perspective to think about, how you would take that if your son said that. And in reality, God's son did die for us, and that's a perspective we should take on as well. And as we think about that, in my own family, I lost a brother about 2 or 3 months before I came to Edmond as a minister. And I saw my parents go through the most devastating thing in their life, and that's the loss of a child. One of our 90 celebrations today has lost 2 sons. The loss of a son has a big impact, and I think that's exactly what this father went through. He even refers to at the end as being dead, and he's alive again. So if you can imagine experiencing that, that's exactly what this story is about. I'm going to quickly read through this in a translation that lends itself more to story, so don't get lost in the detail. But I just want to read it out of another translation and then point out some of the things we learn about the father. Then he said, "There was once a man who had 2 sons. The younger said to his father, 'Father, I want right now what comes to me.' So the father divided the property between them. It wasn't long before the younger son packed his bags and left for a distant country. There, undisciplined and dissipated, he wasted everything he had. And after he had gone through all of his money, there was a bad famine all through the country, and he began to hurt. He signed on with a citizen there who assigned him to the fields to slop the pigs. He was so hungry. He would have eaten the corn cobs in the pig slop, but no one would give him any. That brought him to his senses. He said, 'All those farm hands working for my father sit down to 3 meals a day. Here I am starving to death. I'm going back to my father. I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against God. I've sinned before you. I don't deserve to be called your son. Take me on as a hired hand.' He got up right away and went home to his father. When he was still a long way off, his father saw him, his heart pounding. He ran out, embraced him, and kissed him. The son started his speech. 'Father, I've sinned against God. I've sinned before you. I don't deserve to be called your son ever again.' But the father wasn't listening. He was calling to the servants, 'Quick, bring a clean set of clothes and dress him. Put the family ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then get a grain-fed heifer and roast it. We're going to feast. We're going to have a wonderful time. My son is here, given up for dead and now alive, given up for lost and now found.' And they began to have a wonderful time. All this time, his older son was out in the field. When the day's work was done, he came in. As he approached the house, he heard the music and dancing. Calling over one of the houseboys, he asked, "What's going on?" He told him, "Your brother came home. Your father has ordered a feast, a barbecued beef, because he has him home safe and sound." The older brother stalked off in an angry sulk and refused to join in. His father came out and tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't listen. The son said, "Look, how many years I've stayed here serving you, never giving you one moment of grief. But have you ever thrown a party for me and my friends? Then this son of yours who's thrown away your money on prostitutes shows up, and you go all out with a feast." His father said, "Son, you don't understand. You're with me all the time, and everything that is mine is yours, but this is a wonderful time. We had to celebrate. This brother of yours was dead, and he's alive. He was lost, and he's found." Well, in our Discovery Bible studies, the bookmark has a question on there that asks what we learn about God. And I believe this story lends itself to what we learn about God, his nature, what he cares about, what he thinks about, what is a burden to him, what is a joy to him. And that's what I want to kind of look at tonight as we look at the Father. Real quickly, I think about one thing is it's about relationship. Relationships matter. If you ever have struggles in your family, you know how difficult relationships can be sometimes, but this man had two sons. I know what it's like to have two sons and trying to treat them fairly, equally, and all of that. And they have the younger one approached him and called him a father. But he wanted his stuff, and the father divided the property. That's always kind of shocked me that a father would give in that way, but it says the unselfish nature of God. As much as God cares about a lost son, he was also willing to give a son to have a relationship with us. He was that unselfish. Number two, I think that in verse 17 and 18, it talks about how he is an approachable father. Many people have a struggle with God, coming to God, developing a relationship, because they think that he is unapproachable. And God is he is so holy, we can't approach him on our own, but by the blood of Jesus, we can approach God through his son. But the son, as he was off, he said, "The one thing I know I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and talk to my father. He will listen. He will listen to me." And he went and he talked to him, and he was approachable. The other thing is that the Father loves you. So many people think that God is out to get them, to control them, to put his thumb on them, and to not let them be who they are. And in verse 20, it says, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He had love for him, and he ran to his son. He ran. This is a father. This is an older gentleman. And he runs because he loves his son that much. And he threw his arms around him and kissed him and let him know how valuable he was. The other one, another thing we learn about God is in verse 28. The father went out and pleaded with him. God is calling the prodigal home. God is trying to persuade us. He pleads with us. He begs with us. He will do anything he can, but do it for us. He wants us to do that. He pleads with us like any father who loves his son would do. And probably the most of all that really stands out is the father celebrates when somebody comes home. It was hard for that other son. In some ways, I think this is a parable of two lost sons. Their lostness was different ways. One was socially acceptable and one was not. One was, we think, is really horrible, and we think the other one is just pretty good. But they were both lost. But they had to celebrate. In verse 27, your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back home safe and sound. Verse 30, this son of yours, that's what the brother says, this son of yours, he didn't call him a brother, the son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, and you kill the fattened calf. In those days, they and maybe your family does this, kill an animal to celebrate, a beef or pig or whatever it may be. And they did that, and they celebrated this one, and the older son was kind of upset that he didn't get that same thing. And then finally, the last two verses, my son, the father said, you were always with me, and everything I have is yours, but we had to celebrate and to be glad because this son of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and was found. God's love is what this parable is about. And Psalm 103, verse 13 says, as a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. Now, Sean's going to come and enlighten us from a human perspective, the human nature that we have.
In 1908, the White Line Company was one of the preeminent companies for transatlantic passage ships. But they noticed that they were finally getting beat by their competitors. Another competitor had built the boats, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. Both of these boats were faster than anything that the White Line Company had. And so the White Line Company decided that they were going to do them one better. And they decided they were going to build 3 boats. They might not be faster, but they were going to be more extravagant and more luxurious than anything that their competitors had. So they decided to build the RMS Olympic, the RMS Britannic, and the RMS Titanic. In 1912, the Titanic first left England, and 4 days later, it saw an iceberg. The crew noticed this iceberg. The captain shifted the bearing. They thought they were fine. It looked like they had passed the iceberg, but a spur that was underneath the waterline trenched a 300-foot hole in the side of the hull. Now, the Titanic had been hailed as just the most incredible modern marvel that could possibly exist. It had 4 elevators, a swimming pool, gymnasium, opulent rooms, amazing restaurants, and a grand staircase that tied everything together. It was an incredible ship, and it was known to be the safest possible way to go from England to the United States because it had these safety features that were very new where they could seal off different parts of the boat if it started taking on water. And because of that, it was completely unprepared for the disaster that befell it. Within a few hours, within about 3 hours, the ship had completely sunk. And because it was absolutely unsinkable, a ship that had room, including crew, for more than 3,000 people, had lifeboat space for about 1,500. All in all, after the sinking of the Titanic, about 750 people survived. Since then, the Titanic has become iconic. It has become almost synonymous with human hubris, with arrogance, with pride, with this idea of we can laugh in the face of nature, but then often we get brought low. But it doesn't have to be the only story that fits there. From the Tower of Babel on to our current age, we over and over again see human pride bringing us low, bringing people low. And that's what catches me about the prodigal son. The feature that stands out for me when I look at this individual is his pride. I see his pride before I see everything else. And we have an interesting relationship with pride because on one hand, I think most of us would say that it's something we struggle with in some capacity, in some way. But on the other hand, man, seeing stories of people being brought low, of arrogant heroes falling is one of our favorite things to do. Man, movies are filled with it. Even things that have come out recently are so focused on this narrative. So I really want to take a few minutes and look at this idea of the prodigal son and pride. Now, God is pretty clear about his attitude towards pride. In Proverbs 16:18, he says, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. James 4:10, humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. Luke 14:11, for those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And this is just a tiny little smattering of scriptures that talk about pride. This is just a tiny sample over and over again throughout the Old Testament. Proverbs is rich with it, and throughout the New Testament. We see how God treats the proud and how God treats the humble. But I want to look at the prodigal son's experience with pride and pull a couple of things out of that. First of all, we see the pride that this young man shows and it's incredibly selfish. We see him going to a father that has taken care of him, and he goes to his father and he asks for half of his inheritance. I don't know how that would have gone for you when you were a young man, but I know that mine would have been received with probably laughter, but it wouldn't have gone that well. I can't imagine my dad being like, okay, sure. It would have been pretty incredible. I think Kevin hit on an idea that this was more of an insult than we probably even realize. That if we put this in the context of the Jewish audience that's listening to this, who focuses so heavily on honoring our father and mother, that this would have been a deep insult. And according to some of the writers that I read, this would not only maybe have been a rejection of his father, but a rejection of his family and his community and maybe even his heritage, that he wanted to take what he had and leave. He was very self-focused. He wasn't concerned about having a relationship. He was done with those things. It also put his family in a place where they had half. They now had half of the resources that they did before. And when we look at later on the brother, it might be easy to see where some of his frustration comes from in that regard. He says no to the relationships that are so important to him. He distances himself from those things. And as such, he ends up in a place where he is incredibly isolated. We look later on and we see his fall. We see this progression that he walks. And at the end of that, in part of that, we see, and no one gave him anything. He goes from a place where at least he has a father. We don't know the rest of the story, but at least he has a father who loves him deeply and who cares about him, that he rejects. And he is not able to replace that relationship with any other relationship that's going to take care of him in the same way. He's incredibly selfish, and that takes him to isolation. And what happens after that is he is so ill with pride that his fall takes him further down than it needs to. When we look at the story, we see a young man that goes to a foreign land and runs out of money, which might have been the first time you were like, I'm going to turn around and head home and try to patch things up. He doesn't do it. The second thing that happens is the rumors of the famine, then the famine hits, and then he ends up in this terrible situation. He has numerous places where he could turn things around, where he could have this kind of epiphany, where he could change where he's headed. And he doesn't use any of those opportunities. It takes him being basically at death's door. He's right there to the point of almost starvation, and one of the most humiliating positions he can be in, feeding pigs, before he is able to change his perspective. But he finally gets there. He finally has that experience where he says, I'm gonna go back home. I'm gonna approach my father. And he has what I call like a shower conversation, where you're like thinking through both parts, like I'm gonna say this, and then they'll say this back, and then I'm gonna say this, and kind of runs it all through in his mind. But he doesn't have to use it, really. Because right when he shows up, that father is waiting for him. He runs to him. He doesn't have to make the sales pitch. His father is so happy to see him at a distance. And some of the perspectives that I read said that in one way it was important for the father to be the first one to interact with him, because the rest of the community would likely be so rejecting of him. So one of the reasons that a father might run to interact with his son in that way is to demonstrate forgiveness before anybody else said anything there. I think when we look at our experience with pride, that it might not look exactly like this. I think sometimes we don't think, well, I'm not going to reject my family. I'm not going to reject my relationships. I'm not going to reject all my values. I think the temptation that we have oftentimes is I'm going to compartmentalize. Yeah, I'm going to keep going to church. I'm going to keep being involved. I'm going to keep being engaged. But in this one area, I'm going to say, you know what? I'm really smarter than anybody else in this. Or I really have a better angle on this than maybe God's word does, than God does. So I'm going to do this my way. I'm going to do this part God's way. But I think if we're not careful, these same features of isolation and selfishness and making us so sick that we can't turn things around at the right time can grow even out of those pockets of pride and of those pockets of arrogance. I want to encourage us to think about this idea of how can I turn it around? When can I turn it around? What do I need to do to let go of that pride? What do I need to do to acknowledge the godhood of my Creator and that Father that is waiting for me with open arms?
Thanks, Sean. I think they yielded their extra time to me, which is great. I thought maybe I drew the short straw going last, but I realize I get to reinterpret anything they've said and say whatever I want to. So I hope you're already in Luke chapter 15. The gospel writers, I think, as eyewitnesses, are trying to do something for us. They are trying to explain what it was like to be around Jesus. They believe that if we get to see him like they knew him, that something profound can happen to us. And so they tell us the story of his life, and they share the stories and words that he shared with them, and they open windows into who he was, his character, his disposition, his personality. And so when we go to Luke chapter 15, Jesus is going to make it very clear how God feels about lost people. And I think it's really important tonight to see how this begins in verse 1 of chapter 15. Luke writes, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" And I want you to notice that Jesus doesn't dispute that claim, that the crowd he spends time with, the people he reaches out to on purpose, the prostitutes and the tax collectors, they are sinners. Jesus is not ignorant of that fact. He knows that they're sick and that they need a doctor. And he loves them immensely, but they're lost. He agrees with the Pharisees about the reality, but the difference is when he sees sinful people ruining their lives, he's not angry about it. He feels compassion. He feels sadness. He loves them. His heart is moved. Remember in Matthew chapter 9, and Jesus sees the crowd coming to them, and he realizes that they are harassed like sheep without a shepherd. And he's moved with compassion. And Jesus isn't unkind. He's not judgmental. He isn't naive either. He believes people are suffering because they are disconnected from God. And he knows that when he sits down with tax collectors and prostitutes, that he's sitting down with sinners. But he also knows that when he sits down with Pharisees and scholars, he is sitting down with sinners. Because he knows deep in his soul the world is lost and confused and suffering, and that there's nothing we can do about it. And so he came to make things right. Listen, all around us are lost people. There are people at your work, people on your street, people in your school, people at your yoga class and in your gym, people in your neighborhood and at the coffee shop, and they are lost. And Jesus wants you and I to know that living without God is living lost. And lost people matter to God. And Jesus wants you to know that lost people are incredibly valuable. They're incredibly precious to him and to the Father. They're not rejects. They're not the people that we want to turn away from, that we want to shy away from. God doesn't do that. And so Jesus tells these three stories, the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost sons, back to back to back to drive this point home. People matter to God. All people. And they should matter to you, and they should matter to me. And God doesn't say, well, you know what, I've got 99 other sheep. I've got some coins hidden away somewhere else. I can afford to lose just one. He doesn't say, you see, I've got another son. Parental math doesn't work like that. God's heart is with the lost. And Jesus teaches us here that people are worth the effort and the cost. Lost people are worth it. The woman and the shepherd stop what they're doing. They look hard. They're deliberate. She lights a lamp. He leaves the 99, and they search until they find it. And these aren't just stories. This is who Jesus is. And just 4 chapters later, in Luke chapter 19, Jesus is walking with his disciples along the road, and he looks up and he sees a guy in a tree. And he says, I'm going to have lunch with you today. Why does he do that? Because he knows that God is at work in Zacchaeus, and it is worth his time and effort. And the day ends with Jesus declaring, this man is part of the kingdom. Jesus also tells us that when a person's found, it brings indescribable joy. And I'm sure the crowd listening to him this day was encouraged. They were lifted up by the central message of God's love for the hurting and the broken and the lost. Because really, up until this point, it's been kind of a nice, sentimental truth. No matter what you've done, no matter how far you've strayed, you can always come back to God, and he is waiting. He is watching. He has been searching, and he will, like they said before, he will run to you and then throw a party. But Jesus knows something. Jesus knows that not everyone in the crowd is going to hear that the way he hopes they will. And not everyone will hear it the way he intends. I'm sure if they'd been paying attention, they might have known what was coming. It should have been familiar to them, even if it was unsettling, because Jesus often turned the story against the religious people. Simon, I have something to tell you. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. Or Jesus would say, the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers in his vineyard. I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. Or which is better, to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath? Or bring me a coin. Over and over and over again, Jesus turns the story to address the religious. And this story is no different. Look in verse 24 with me. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found. And so they begin to celebrate. Wouldn't this be a great place to end the story? It's wrapped up nicely. Everybody's home. Everybody's happy. But Jesus doesn't stop there. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. And when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father's killed the fattened calf because he has him back, safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you're always with me. Everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And Jesus tells the story this way because he knows there are 2 kinds of lost people. Kevin mentioned this earlier. There are those who are lost in their selfish living, and there are those who are lost in their arrogance and their pride of living right. There's some telltale signs of living like the older brother. You can see it in his language, the way he talks to his father. He's disrespectful. He's relationally distant. Like Kevin said, he can't even say the word brother. He's selfish. And he's resentful of his brother's return and his father's celebration of it. You see, the older brother sees God's love, God's grace, God's mercy as a limited commodity. There's only so much of it to go around. It's something to be bargained for, something to be exchanged. And so when the younger brother comes home, and he's already squandered his share, the older brother can only see that his piece, what's rightfully coming to him, is going to be diminished. And he's resentful. And the root of his resentment is entitlement. The son knows how this is supposed to go. He expects that serving and obeying his father is going to be hard work. It might even be drudgery, but in the end, he'll receive what's due him. It's a posture that says, I have a claim because I've been good. It's the same claim the Pharisees made about their goodness. God owes us. And Jesus sees right through them. In Matthew 23, he calls them blind 5 different times. He says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. And woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You're like whitewashed tombs. You look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you're full of hypocrisy and wickedness. That's the older brother. He's doing everything right. He looks great on the outside, but on the inside, he's rotting away. And Jesus is not gentle when he's dealing with the Pharisees, and he's not going to be tender when he's trying to wake us up either. And I know this because I'm blind too. I am a recovering older brother. Too often, I want following Jesus to deliver. I want it to mean that I get what I want and I end up a winner. But that's not how it works. No one makes a claim on God based on their goodness. So how do you know what kind of brother you are? It's pretty easy to identify the younger brother. It's practically self-evident, even if you have to come to your senses to see it. But what about the older brother? How do you know if you're like him? Here's a few tests and questions. Is there anger just under the surface of your life that boils over when things don't go the way you think they should, or people don't do what you think they should? How do you treat people in your life who have completely squandered what they've been given because of the choices they've made? Do you ever think that they deserve what's happened to them? Do you consider anyone unreachable? Another question. Are you skeptical when someone who seems utterly lost comes to Jesus? Do you celebrate it or do you question it? One more test. Do you prioritize laws over love? Do you emphasize policies over people? What about politics over people? Which one wins out? In your heart of hearts, what's most important? In Romans chapter 2, verse 4, Paul says, or do you show contempt? It sounds like the older brother. Do you show contempt for the riches of God's kindness, his forbearance and patience, not realizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? You see, that's the good news of the story. The Father comes to get both sons. They both matter to the Father. It doesn't matter how they became lost. Lost sons and lost daughters matter to the Father. And so what's the word Jesus has for you tonight? Is he trying to wake you up? Is he trying to jostle you to come to your senses and come home? Or maybe his word to you tonight is the voice of the Father that begs you to let go of the entitlement and resentment and come join the celebration. Live a life of love and joyful gratitude. So if you want to come home tonight, maybe you want to declare that Jesus is Lord of your life. You want to put him on in baptism. We're here to do that with you. If you want to confess, have the prayers of this family, we're here to do that too.